If I told you there is a fern that looks like bacon and is really easy to care for, would you be interested? Well, I guess you are, because today we're going to talk about Asplenium nidus. This is also called the bird's nest fern and is looking like bacon. Yeah, it's looking like green bacon. I mean, it looks like crispy bacon that you left in the pan for too long, but it's actually stunning and it has very sturdy leaves. Let's have a look at how you care for Asplenium nidus, or also called the bird's nest fern or crispy wave fern. Alright, let's start with soil. Asplenium nidus needs well-draining soil, but also soil that retains some water. In terms of potting soil, Asplenium nidus thrives in soil consisting of peat moss, perlite, organic potting mix, coarse sand. These kind of ingredients are just optimal for an Asplenium nidus because they hold and retain moisture well, but they're also well draining because you don't want your fern in soggy soil. Because Asplenium nidus is a epiphyte, this means this is a plant that is growing on other plants in nature. And these plants are usually used to organic leaf matter, these kind of things, and they're not used to regular potting soil and therefore need a very well draining soil to thrive. Watering. Asplenium nidus needs sufficient watering. It should never dry out actually. So optimal watering is if you water about once a week or even a bit more. The soil should always stay a little bit moist. So you should make sure that it never actually drains out completely. Therefore, you can use your index finger and stick it into your soil. If it's slightly moist, it's perfectly fine. Just make sure that it is not soggy and extremely wet, but it should always be a little bit humid because we're dealing with a fern here. Remember, ferns really need moisture to thrive. This one actually I got a couple of months ago. It has a lot of black patches, and these patches came from probably too much sunlight and also not enough watering. With ferns, you should always have slightly humid soil. So one thing to take away and remember here is don't let the soil dry out. Make sure that you water about once a week, but usually in summer you might have to water a little bit more. You should always check whether it's still humid or not. But the soil itself should take care of it. So if you have a great potting soil mix, you will have one that retains moisture a bit. If you have like a really well draining soil mix without any components that hold water, you're gonna have a hard time with this fern. So make sure you get the potting soil mix correct first, and then watering will be a breeze. Temperature. In terms of temperature, the crispy wave fern prefers a temperature between 60 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 15 to 22 degrees Celsius. 60 degrees Fahrenheit should be the lower limit because these ferns are growing in humid conditions in nature, and you need to make sure that it doesn't get too cold for them. So rather keep them between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that's optimal. Actually, optimal conditions for a crispy wave fern would be in a terrarium because the humidity needs to be really high, and this is the next topic we're going to talk about, humidity. All right. The crispy wave fern needs really high humidity between 16 and 90%. 60% is already quite high and 90% is extremely high. Mostly 90% humidity you will only get if you keep a crispy wave fern in a terrarium or in an enclosed plastic container. If you can do so, that's perfect. If you can't, you still can grow a crispy wave fern. You just need to make sure that the humidity level stays high. So place this plant with other plants really close and densely together. This way you can increase the humidity, or if you can use a humidifier. With a humidifier you can easily strive for 60 to 80% humidity, and your crispy wave fern will really like these conditions because they grow in jungles and really humid conditions. This is quite important because otherwise you don't just get a crispy wave fern, you get a wave fern that is gonna look like a crispy bacon that you baked for too long. Propagation. In terms of propagation, ferns are usually difficult to be propagated because either they propagate themselves or they are quite hard to propagate. It's exactly the same with the crispy wave fern. It's really hard to propagate because you can't propagate a crispy wave fern with its leaves. You also can't propagate a crispy wave fern from seeds or something like that. The way you can propagate the crispy wave fern is by its spores. and the spores are under the fronds. Crispy wave ferns are propagated by their fronds. So this is this bird's nest center, or it got the name bird's nest fern because of these fronds that are brownish. In order to propagate a crispy wave fern, you need to take a mature frond, cut it off and put it into a paper bag. Within a couple of days, the spores underneath will start to fall off, and you then put them in humid sphagnum moss, and in a closed container. Within a couple of weeks, a new fern might start to grow. It might start to set out spores and grow leaves. This is the almost only way you can propagate a crispy wave fern. Of course, the other being tissue culture, where you need a whole lab in order to do so. So these aren't the easiest plants to propagate for sure. The longer you get a crispy wave fern, the bigger the chances are that new fronds are starting to build and you get like a huge cluster, and spores might start to set out. So this way you can also get more of your crispy wave fern. Fertilizer. As it is with most ferns, you don't need to fertilize a crispy wave fern that much because they are really gentle creatures. But I suggest to fertilize every month or so in spring and summer. I suggest using a liquid fertilizer with an increased nitrogen and potassium value, because this way you're providing exact nutrients a crispy wave fern needs. I'm not fertilizing in autumn and winter. That is perfectly fine because these plants are not growing that much in that season. So that's pretty much all there is to say about fertilization. Even without fertilizer, with a good potting soil, your fern should be completely fine. But if you want it to grow as much as possible, use a liquid fertilizer once a month in spring and summer. All right, potting. In terms of potting, you need a small pot only. It will not get too wide. Every 2 or 3 years, you can look for a bigger pot that is maybe an inch or two bigger for your crispy wave fern. And this way it has the potential to grow larger and larger, but these are plants that are not growing extremely fast, and therefore there's not much to do in terms of repotting. Yeah, so I mentioned that you don't need to repot it as much. And also an interesting fact is probably that a crispy wave fern will grow as big as the container it is in. So if you want to grow it bigger, just provide a bigger container over time, but only in increments. So go an inch or two bigger each time. And within a couple of years, your crispy wave fern will fill the container, no matter how big it is. But as said, only go in increments. Let's talk about a few common problems for the crispy wave fern. Like one of the biggest problems is leaf rot, or rotting of the center of the crispy leaf fern, and this is mostly caused by incorrect watering. So if you are watering, do not water in the center, because then the crown is going to be affected. And also do not water over the leaves, because when water is sitting for too long on the leaves or the crown, it may start to rot. Talking about other common problems, one problem is pests. The main pest that is infesting a crispy wave fern are scale. Scale are really easy to determine because they're not extremely small. They usually are on the underside of the leaves. Of course, they can also be on the upper side of the leaves, but you usually find them on the underside of the leaves, and they will center around this midrib right here. And a good thing about the scale insect is that it's hardly moving. A bad thing about scales are that they have a really hard shell that is hard to dissolve. So what you're using to get rid of scale is rubbing alcohol. With a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol, you can easily just put it on the scale and they will dissolve. Another thing you can do is just you take your bare hand and you scrub off the scale insects. They're not moving, they're not quick, so they are easy to get rid of as long as they are not present in huge numbers. Yeah, and probably like a third common problem is watering, because as I said, crispy wave ferns need to be constantly moist. So you need to make sure that you're not skipping on watering, because once they become dry, the leaves are going to dry and fall off, and your whole crispy wave fern can fall apart. This is not the kind of plant that you forget when going on holidays. If you come back, it might be totally crispy, and you certainly don't want that, right? Light. Let's talk about light for the crispy wave fern for a second. So the crispy wave fern needs bright indirect light, as many houseplants do. In nature, crispy wave ferns might be in the understory and covered by other plants. They may get partly shade or even full shade, but anything a crispy wave fern gets in nature or outside will be much brighter than anything you can provide inside mostly. Therefore, bright indirect light is perfect. Just watch out for bright direct light in a south-facing window. As an example, just make sure that bright direct light is not shining onto the leaves of your crispy wave fern for a couple of hours, because this way the leaves of your crispy wave fern might burn. Just make sure the crispy wave fern gets bright indirect light. A great window direction is the eastern or western facing windows, as well as the south facing window. If you put the plant a couple of feet away from the window, there should be no problem. But I would recommend a eastern facing window, because this way it gets a lot of bright indirect sunlight throughout the day and a couple of hours of direct sunlight in the morning where it's not that strong. That's perfectly fine. Or you go for a western facing window where you have bright indirect light for a big part of the day. This was another plant care video, this time about the crispy wave fern. Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also leave a comment. And we thank you from the bottom of our heart for all the kind support you're giving us. Thank you so much for watching, and see you again soon.